I'm just so excited about this combination to have the author of the book as well as a founder of a independent bookstore. It's fantastic. Evan Friss is a New York Times best-selling author and a professor of history at James Madison University. And if you read the book, you know that history is woven in every page of this book. His most recent book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore, garnered rave reviews in the Washington Post, the New York Times, People, and other popular outlets. He lives with his wife, a bookseller, and 2 children, occasional booksellers, in Harrisonburg, Virginia. As mentioned in the program, so I hope you all got a program. There's programs on the corner there. The Bookshop is a love letter to bookstores, a charming chronicle for anyone who cherishes these sanctuaries of literature, an essential reading to understand how these vital institutions have shaped American life and why we still need them. And Mr. Friss will be interviewed by Hannah Oliver Depp. It's a fantastic addition to the program as the founder of the Loyalty Bookstores in Petworth, D.C., in D.C. and Virginia. Loyalty serves all readers as an intersectional feminist bookstore and programming space. Hannah holds a master's degree in English from American University and is a founding member of the American Booksellers Association's Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So please join us in welcoming our author and our interviewer.
Thank you. And how nice is it to be at the Gaithersburg Book Festival, not in the rain? It's so, I was like, are we sure it's the 3rd Saturday in May? Like, are we sure? I'm not positive. It's just a nice little breeze. It's going to be a beautiful day. It's always a beautiful day at a book festival, but it's nice to not, I threw an umbrella in strictly out of habit. And that way it won't rain because I have an umbrella. Knock on. There's no one up here. We'll figure it out. I'm very excited about this. I have read and listened to this book, and as a bookseller will tell you, that usually means that we're deeply invested in it. And we were probably doing 4 other things the first time, so we had to go back a second time. This book is definitely a love letter to indies, but it's also very practical history. A lot of times when independent booksellers, there's a lot of books about books. That's actually like, books about bookstores or books about publishing or books about books. It's a whole subgenre. We could have, depending on square footage in our store, have whole subsections, right, just devoted to that. And those of us that love the arts of books, love the arts of bookselling, can get a little tired of them sometimes. Only because they always seem to leave out the practical side of it. Some are truly wonderfully devoted to the art of hand selling. Some are truly wonderfully devoted to the art of making the shop look cute. Some are just beautiful picture guides, which I must confess I do love spying on other people's bookstores. But this book, when it was first pitched to me, as someone who buys the books that come into the bookstore for you all to buy, I kind of went, oh no, it's gonna be like, isn't it, art bookstores wonderful and they smell nice, and there should be 1,000 of them, and also they should just exist, and the reason they don't is because people don't care about books anymore and people don't care about reading anymore, and isn't everybody naughty? But instead, it was this really wonderful combination of history, cautionary tale, uplifting tale, a lot of data, a lot of information, and also a true understanding of what it takes in the everyday to keep a store going, to keep a store afloat, and the joy of the community that actually makes a bookstore what it is, not just the actual 4 walls of the bookstore. So I just never actually got a chance. We just met in person 2 seconds ago. We've chatted a few times, but I never really got a chance to say thank you, because the book is very special. It is truly written by someone, the fact that your partner is a bookseller does shine through. I think maybe little authorial credit there, but it really shines through, and I am curious. This is a very long preamble / thank you. I'm curious to know how on earth did you get, first of all, a green light to write a serious history of the American bookstore, and secondly, why you stuck with it after talking to a bunch of cantankerous booksellers?
Well, thank you for coming, and thanks to all the volunteers helping out. And I am embarrassed to admit that I've never, before this book, been to a book festival and had heard about
Never
them.
mind, everyone go home.
But I've become a big fan, and not just as the person up here hawking my book, but it's just an amazing. I'm a historian, and sometimes I go to academic conferences. You don't want to go to those. But this is just a kind of meeting space for bibliophiles. People are wearing book T-shirts, and people are just giddy to be around books and authors. And I'm in the same boat, and it's great to be surrounded by book lovers and readers and writers and booksellers. And I've been interviewed, by a bunch of people, but my favorite people to talk to are the booksellers, because they're wise, and they know the story better than I did. So I wrote the book. It would be very hard for a bookseller to write this book because it takes so much time to do and a lot of research. And Green Lit, I had thought about this project for many years. So as Hannah mentioned, the impetus was really my then girlfriend, now wife, who worked at 3 Lives and Company, which is just the most kind
We're
of...
going to talk about 3 Lives.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I won't get into it.
We're going to talk about it.
But she was a bookseller, and it gave me a taste of what it was like from the other side of the counter. And I had been a customer, a serious reader, and appreciated these spaces, but hadn't seriously thought about the work that goes into and the kind of power and influence and responsibility that comes on the other side. And so it gave me a window into that world, and it made me think about bookstores as much more dimensional kind of spaces than I had imagined. And that planted, the seed. And the best part of it was, so my wife, who now owns a bookshop, at the time she was thinking about opening a shop. And so we would both go and do a lot of survey trips. I was going for data to research,
The
meeting
best
people.
part about the planning stage of running a bookstore is you're like, well, I have to go visit a bunch of bookstores. It's the best part.
Yeah. So she would be taking photographs and, what works here, what doesn't, what is your POS system? And I would be interviewing customers and booksellers and trying to get my own data we had I wouldn't say parallel because they sometimes intersected, but we had related research goals that sometimes overlapped. And it made it a lot of fun. And I do think, or I hope, that the book is a reflection of me being a historian and a scholar and reading lots of stuff and trying to be scholarly and professorial, but also melded with a real love of bookstores, and hopefully that the book, I'm not embarrassed about the fact that I fell in love with a bookseller, and that's sort of the origin story of the book. In
We're
fact,
adorable.
yeah. So that's part of the story itself.
Yeah. I think, again, one of the things that made me go, oh, never mind, I do want to read this book and bother the author because, well, for one thing, my bookstore's in there. But also, I think it's fascinating because your introduction spends a long time in 3 Lives, and I promise we're going to get back to it because it's the perfect bookstore. But also, the first chapter is about the UPS driver, and that's when I knew you knew what you were talking about. There is nothing like the bond between an independent bookstore and their UPS driver. I would die for these people, and we are very close. I have the cell phone numbers of 3 UPS drivers in my phone. They're starred, okay? We are very close. And it's because, I mean, imagine you're on a route for years sometimes, and a bookstore opens up on your corner, and you're like, now I'm carrying 70-pound boxes every day into this, like, awkwardly, the shop that often is filled with sharp corners, and I'm trying to maneuver around things. They don't have a delivery entrance. You know, they're in a side street in a city somewhere, or they're in the middle of a suburb. It doesn't matter where they are. It's hard to get the books in the door, I promise you. And you must become close to these people. But also they are literally, you described them as Santa Claus. And it is the thing, because I think the true part about being a bookseller is you're always excited to open the box of books. You're always excited. And a lot of things will take the quote-unquote romance out of the bookstore for you, but nothing, if you still have that, no matter how long you've been doing it. I book sold at Politics and Prose for many years. Shout out to Politics and Prose. Do visit the bookselling tent. And you know, that store had been open for a long time. By the time I started there, I started right before Brad and Lissa, who we all still call the new owners, but now it's been over a decade, took over the space. And then I went and apprenticed for another bookstore, and then I opened my own bookstore. And one of the things that struck me was that the people who seemed to be committed to this for the long haul had a really unique combination of practicality and belief in magic. And I think that's why the UPS driver matters so much. You really encapsulated that. What was some of the characteristics you found interviewing all of these booksellers across the country and then doing all this research for bookstores throughout history in America? What are some recurring themes amongst these strange people who pick this strange job?
Yeah, I think booksellers are definitely a species unto themselves. And part of the premise or purpose of the book is to showcase how bookstores are unlike any other kind of place, whether that be an institution of some sort, certainly different than any other kind of retail outlet. And a lot of that has to do with the people. Obviously, the books are the draw, and we can talk about the power and magic of books and stories, which is, you know, the origin point for why we all walk into a bookstore to begin with. But especially in the 21st century, the reason that we continue to walk into the bookstore is because it's human, because of the people, including Vaughn, the UPS driver, who now delivering books is very hard on your back. I'll say that.
And your knees.
And your knees. But also the booksellers. And so many of the books, I felt like I kept saying this line over and over again in the book, was something like, you know, this bookshop was a reflection of the bookseller. Loyalty, you can see Hannah in Loyalty Books. And across history, Ben Franklin has a bookstore. I write about avant-garde bookshops in New York, the Gotham Book Mart, where this woman, Frances Stelloff, literally lived inside of this bookstore. And when she died, the bookstore couldn't really survive because it was her personified in such a way. And sometimes that's more manifest than others in the kind of the shops, but I think it's probably common knowledge, or it should be, that book selling is not a lucrative business. Usually, however, it attracts typically very intelligent and hardworking people who often have more lucrative paths available to them. And so it's not a trope, it's not an exaggeration. It's always a passion project. I mean, you might find somebody who's just looking for a job working at a bookstore when they're 16 years old, but rarely, and the number of people who probably come into your shop and say, I want to work here, it's just unbelievable. And most of those people don't expect to make a fortune. But it's because they love books, and that love is hopefully infectious, palpable enough that it kind of, you know, it suffuses the atmosphere of the shop and is, again, part of what makes these spaces human and magical, but also practical. And people, and I think it's written on the back of the book that it's a love letter to bookstores, which it is. But one of the hardest things to write about was the kind of 21st century. And I wanted to strike a fair tone in terms of the state of book selling over the last 20 or 30 years and the state of book selling today. And there are practical challenges that are not insurmountable, but create very high hurdles. And so the people who are succeeding, like Hannah, are doing even more of a miraculous job than it appears, that we often take for granted, the kind of wizardry that goes into curating the right kind of bookshop.
It is, I could sit here and give you a litany of things. Like sometimes we have to explain, like, oh, the books literally fell off of a slow boat coming from China. Like they actually fell into the sea. That happened last holiday season. That we don't print and bind many books in the U.S. anymore. So even though books are exempt from some of the trade dealings, they are restricted by the paper and the cardboard coming in from out of the country. It's a slow-moving business in a fast-moving world. There's a lot of things that cause tension. But I think one of the things the book does so well is talk about how the bookshop and books themselves have been predicted to be dying since we started predicting things. Every decade, someone publishes an article about how every day, sometimes it feels like, about how bookstores don't exist anymore. And I remember there's a chapter from your book that was printed, I think it was in WAPO, but it might have been the Times, about what happened to the black bookstore in America. And there was a sort of a boom and a bust, and now there's a resurgence. And some people were like, they read the headline, which you don't get to decide, and go, he's saying that black bookstores don't exist anymore. But actually it was a very thoughtful history about what has happened to black booksellers and how black booksellers have overcome it, and how it's a microcosm of a really fantastic example of how difficult it is to do bookselling in this country to begin with. Other countries have protected tax status for bookstores. They have rent control for bookstores. They have a lot of safeguards and protections for small businesses in general that we don't have. So you see that surmounted by then issues of lack of access to credit, lack of access to stable leases and things like that happen, as well as hate crimes, targeting from the FBI, all those fun, wonderful things that can happen to any bookstore but happen disproportionately to black bookstores. How have you found balancing that story and trying to tell the story when it either sort of shuts people down right away sometimes because they just want the bookstore to be charming and not complicated, or when you're talking about that, so you're like, oh, you're not talking about the full picture, you're missing it, you're missing how hard it is.
Yeah, it's a difficult balancing act, and if there is one overarching theme in bookselling history, it's that it's a precarious business, and the discourse has been about that it's on the verge of collapse, and that discourse isn't entirely off base. Like, there's good reason for people to think that we are approaching the demise of the bookstore. So in the colonial times, talked about the trouble of binding and cost of paper. Benjamin Franklin is operating this print shop bookstore in colonial Philadelphia. Hardly anybody can read. Books are enormously expensive compared to the current day. So the market is so small, and he and his contemporaries had to survive by selling mostly not books. He was a newspaper guy, he was the postmaster, and he sold chocolate and, gift stuff, items.
I like to bring this up when anyone yells at me for having candles at the store.
Yes, right. Modern booksellers call them sidelines, and every customer has their own sort of calculus about what crosses the line of when a bookstore ceases to feel like a bookstore. Even, by the way, Barnes & Noble. So I interviewed James Daunt, the current CEO of Barnes & Noble, and he said they're really moving away. They had too many sidelines that he would walk into a bunch of the locations and it just didn't feel like a bookstore anymore. So everybody has to find their own balance. But it is true that when you go into a bookstore, the non-book items tend to be higher margin than the books themselves. So from colonial times to low literacy rates and high cost, we think of libraries as this amazing public benefit, which they are, But you could imagine the American Booksellers Association 150 years ago thinking, this is nuts. Nobody's ever going to buy a book if you can get it at the library. And people had good reason to think that this was going to be kind of doom times. And then, of course, it was, the radio and then television and film and more recently e-books, which again, the rate at which people were e-reading was just skyrocketing. And many, many smart people did the math and said people aren't going to buy print books anymore. And it just turned out, society and experts were wrong. So I think the precarity of book selling, yes, is very real. And I don't endorse kind of doom and gloom scenarios. And I see many healthy bookstores. But I think it is also useful for us to remember that these are fragile businesses, and that I write somewhere in the introduction that bookstores would be on an endangered species list. And that's true. If you just look at the raw numbers of bookstores per capita in the United States, it's a fraction of what it was 30 years ago. And there's no kind of dancing around that. There are many stories to celebrate, but in order for us to keep celebrating them, we need to embrace the precarity and fragility of these spaces and make sure that we support them so they can continue to support us.
It's a very strange dance because actually the amount of independent bookstores opening has risen dramatically, but it's still such a fraction of what it was before the mostly online commerce. Barnes & Noble and Borders were very predatorial at first. Now we're all sort of queasily coexisting and figuring it out because we belong in neighborhoods, and there's something that binds you to another physical location selling a book. And of course, independent booksellers have embraced selling books over the internet, figuring out how we can sell ebooks, how we can sell audiobooks, things like that, because I think people go, well, you need to do that to survive. And that's true. But also booksellers are readers, and they have reasons that they might need to be able to enlarge the font on any book available, or that they want to be able to read on their commute as well. So I think that is something that often is missed in the doom and gloom, is that the bookseller is a reader. And the decisions they make are going to be based in decisions as a reader, which is also why they're not profitable. But that's one of the many reasons. It's actually, it's the most fun reason that they're not profitable, I would say, as opposed to all the very dire reasons. The book selling numbers have grown, but also a lot of bookstores don't make it past year 5 for a lot of the reasons. Sometimes they're personal choice reasons, because again, these are people at the core of this. It's, I need to move across the country for my child or my spouse's health. I need to, I want to retire, and I don't actually want to sell the bookstore. I just want the bookstore to close, X, Y, Z. And then sometimes it's, I had a 5-year lease and the landlord decided to double the rent, and there's no protections against that, so my bookstore has to close because there's not a lot of shop space in my community. There's different reasons, some personal, some larger, that stores have the open and closure rate that they do. But I think it is more precarious for many reasons now. I was running late to this because we started off our day with some death threats and phone calls that my bookstore gets on the regular. It's a part of my week. Those things have obviously gone up in the last few years, but they were something that we had training in my store from the design of it when I opened in 2019. Because we were going to be a Black queer space. It was going to draw the attention of people. The permission to express those views loudly has gone up from some folks in the last few years, so it has become more of a persistent presence. But it's something we had to tie into our training, and it's these things that some people go, it's part of the overall calculus of whether or not to keep running your shop. For me, it just makes me more ornery. Loyalty was by and large opened out of spite because someone told me Black people don't read. I was like, ha ha ha. Watch me. So, that's how my calculus works, but it's not how everybody's calculus works. There's an increase in minority-owned or minoritized-owned shops in the country. These are all good things to celebrate, and we want to celebrate them loudly. But everyone only has so much space in their head, right? And not everyone's going to read a full, thorough history book like yours. And I wish I could, because it really does show the balance of things can go up and down, but it's really about the neighborhood surrounding each shop. You can sell books online to go across the country, which I do all the time, but there's something so important about whether or not your individual neighborhood and you are in lockstep. Which brings me to 3 Lives and Company. I call 3 Lives and Company the platonic ideal of a bookstore. If you are ever in New York City, head off to the West Village, find it. It's amazing that it exists. As you talk about in the book, they don't have, I think they have like 9 cards that are like painted by a local artist in the community. They have 1 tote bag that is the 3 Lives tote bag. It is very strange. But the reason 3 Lives is like that is because it is a reflection of that neighborhood, especially of that neighborhood at the time in which it opened. It is an extremely affluent community, so they can afford the books at the price. And also, it is shepherded by someone. It was shepherded by the women who opened the store and shepherded by the person who bought the store in the 90s, I think? 2000? 90s? Somewhere around late 90s, early 2000s, who understood the assignment, let's say. And then similarly, you have bookstores around the country who may have way more gift items because there's a ton of children in their community, and they're the place everyone goes to buy their gifts on Saturday morning before the birthday parties because they did not have time during the week. I am one of those stores. And it is important and imperative that each bookstore reflect its community. And you talk about 3 Lives, people referring to it as the shop. They come to say hi to the bookstore because the booksellers have made of what they are, but they also open their doors to their community to exist. It's such a fragile piece sometimes. And I loved the way you painted so many different stores, and in your interview with different booksellers, that the measure of success of a shop is if we say, can it stay open until next week? Sometimes that's the most practical part of it. But I think the true measure is when you walk in a store and you understand the neighborhood around the store. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the places you found?
Yeah, and so my favorite thing about 3 Lives, and she mentioned the owner, his name is Toby Cox, and it was this great shop opened in the 70s by these 3 women, and it's in a very affluent neighborhood, and he took it over, and his whole goal was to just
not mess it up.
Yes, not mess it up. He thinks of, and I write about this in the book, but he says he's the custodian of the shop, and he hopes to hand it off to somebody else. And I won't talk about it too much, but it really is it's a community that people have affection for, that goes as important as the owner and bookseller is, and as important as all of the amazing booksellers who work there are. It's also an institution that has out-survived all of the amazing people who've gone through it. And the people who are committed to working there are committed to keeping the what makes it so special, which is an extraordinary number of things that I won't go into, but it's just it's a romantic kind of ideal of a bookstore. It seems like it should be in a movie and it doesn't exist, but it does actually exist, and it can't exist everywhere. It's in a very expensive part of Manhattan, and it has very affluent customers, and it doesn't sell lots of other things, but
And I think it's also, there's a joke that it makes in the book that every bookseller is like, the time I started bookselling was the peak of bookselling, and it's all been downhill ever since. But there's certain socioeconomic things that made the stores that opened from the 70s to the 80s able to survive a lot of things, and not all of them did. But if they open today, would they or would they not survive in the current economic conditions? But they have this history behind them now that's helping them stay through our current situation.
yeah, and it's important to remember, as much as we extol bookstores and want them to propagate, that most people, large chunks and swaths of the country, are in bookstore deserts.
Yes.
That the number of new bookstores opening is great, but they also tend to be concentrated in areas where there are lots of people, and probably other bookstores around. And it's very hard, and the idea of opening a bookstore in some very small town somewhere is exceedingly difficult. And, even Three Lives, and there's a whole story, but basically it was renovated and Toby didn't know if it could stay in the building that it's in. And the landlord who renovated the building for these, very luxurious apartments with, many millions of dollars they cost, just wanted a bookshop in the bottom. And part of it was kind of social and cultural capital, but I think also part of it is financial, that it just, like, if you're going to buy an $8 million apartment, good for you. Congratulations.
We are different.
But wouldn't it also be nice that when you walk downstairs, there's not a Chase Bank, but a cute little independent bookshop, and it fits into that ideal image of the village that you're paying all that money for. So there is a kind of double-sidedness to that, and we have to be thinking about how we can, and the American Booksellers Association has worked on this, increase and diversify the ranks of booksellers, but also geographically to try and promote and encourage and sustain bookstores for lots of people in lots of different communities.
I'm the president of our regional trade association, which basically goes a little bit above and a little bit below, but mostly it's the Mid-Atlantic. And a huge swath of ours are in suburban Pennsylvania. And so people go, oh, it's got New York, it's got Philly, it's got Baltimore, it's got D.C. And you're like, actually, a lot of people are in strip malls in suburban Pennsylvania, and part of my job is to figure out how to make those stores successful, as well as the stores we tend to think of, like Three Lives. And they do face different challenges. And they sometimes... I look at them and I go, oh my God, your rent is so much lower. That's so great. And they go, oh my God, you're on the Amtrak line and authors can stop by and visit, right? So we all have different challenges, and we all reflect a different makeup of our country and of our communities. I think one thing people tend to kind of idealize is the bookseller behind the counter reading all day. I've never seen it. It is the Bigfoot of bookselling. And you might capture us looking at a book, but it's usually trying to figure out, where on earth does this get shelved? This doesn't make sense. This is in 9 categories. But I usually find that you mentioned everyone walks in the door. Not everyone. A lot of people walk in the door. They go, oh, I've always wanted to open a bookstore, or oh, I always wanted to work in a bookstore. And you, depending on your mood in that moment, might decide to crush their dreams. Or encourage them, or just try to be like, how much did you find writing this book? Did it crush any of your dreams? Were they already crushed because you had a voice on the inside already?
Well, I'm not heroic or crazy enough to open a bookstore. My wife was, but there are people, very kind people who...
Shout out her bookstore, come on.
Yeah, shout out. Parentheses Bookstore in Harrisonburg, Virginia, if you're ever down in the valley. There are people... Some of the nicest reviews that I got for the book were the reviewer... This was sort of like the Washington Post review, where the reviewer uses it as an opportunity to talk about their own experience with bookstores. And like they're not really talking the book good or well written. They're just like, they have space to reminisce about their child, and I think that's great. And I loved it. And there was a lot of
book. This place I went to the beach when I was a child had this bookstore. Yeah.
And I think a lot of us have that. And some people have written me very kindly and said, I love your book, and it inspired me to think more seriously about opening my own bookstore. And I don't know how to respond to that, because I'm happy and I promote it, but I also don't want to be blamed for...
Right. I read this book, and I think you told the truth.
It's a hard... and the reading, so much of what booksellers are reading are things that are not out yet. And I think it's hard for most of us to imagine the curating that is involved. And Hannah's shop is not particularly large. Three Lives is 650 square feet. There are millions of books being published every year, and among terrorists that are terrorizing you, there's perfectly nice neighbors that also terrorize booksellers and say, I wrote this book. Can you please carry it? You know, I'm a local author. And as a bookseller, you want to support your community and you want to support local authors. And yet, there's a very limited amount of shelf space available. And so what you see at the bookshop represents a very small, a fractional size, sample size of what's out there. Yeah. And that's where the booksellers, their reading is so critical, because they really are oftentimes reading reviews, reading advanced reader copies, thinking deeply about not just what's going to sell, which is obviously important. And I think these decisions get at the heart of what makes the bookshop so special, because they want something that can sell, but they also want stuff that they love. Yeah. And those go hand in hand, because it's easier to sell something you love than you don't. But
I'm a spreadsheet person, and it is absolutely I tried to make a spreadsheet of the equation of like, how many of this do I have to sell, whether I like it or not, because it's a better margin from a major publisher, and it's a popular book, to sell as many tiny indie presses when books in translation or whatever that I want. And it is an equation you do every day, and that's a part of curation. We often talk about bookstores and curation, and that's what makes them special. They try to reflect their community, they try to reflect the taste, they try to steward the shop. But there's also the equation of literally staying open, and the way those two things intersect are endlessly fascinating to me. That's why I'm as interested in the business of bookselling as I am in the romance of bookselling. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions before we have to skedaddle.
We've actually given you 10 minutes for questions.
Ooh.
We thought there would be more questions than 5 minutes would allow.
Ah, you're gorgeous.
So, who has a question?
I just had a question about, you said ebook reading took off. Personally, I hate reading electronically. And so I know my reasons for not reading electronically, but did you do research, or do you know like into why ebook reading actually, like, you can keep a bookstore open because people do want physical books. So I was just wondering the reasons behind that and the research into that.
yeah, I think it just plateaued the number of people who, the kind of advantages of it, obviously carrying a library, being able to enlarge the font. But I think the kind of naysayers underestimated the degree to which people prefer the tactile feel and the physical sense of having a book enough that they were willing to pay for books that cost more money, have them take up shelf space. But it's not meaningless, and I mentioned this only briefly in the introduction, but being surrounded by books matters, and this is just a plug. Now, if you're a hoarder, you know, I'm not, that's a different story.
There are not 19 piles by my bed. What are you talking about?
You know, sociologists have found that just growing up in a house full of books, even if you don't see your parents reading them, makes a difference and makes those kids more likely to be readers. And I mentioned this too many times to the people on campus. We're rebuilding a library at James Madison University, and I went to some focus group, and everybody's like, we need, you know, study tables, and we need big glass walls, and we need Starbucks.
Where
I'm
are the
like,
shelves
what about
going?
the books? And they're like, well, people don't check them out as much. I was like, I just it needs to feel like a library, and I need to be surrounded by books and have that sense of wonder and awe, and at least momentarily make me feel inquisitive.
There's also, in addition to the sales did sort of plateau, they kind of found as many people as, and they're steady. They're not, but they deeply underestimated how many people would do both. Like, the way that we talk about humans as if everybody's existing purely on a binary. Like, you either e-read or you read physical copies, and you'll never do both. And I'm like, I'm doing it all, man. Give me a book. Give me a story. So I think there's a lot of that, is that a lot of the predictions just assume no one would ever buy a physical book again if they also read on a device.
And just a quick plug, because not everybody knows, but you can buy ebooks now from bookshop.org, which supports local indie bookstores, and Libro FM has a similar platform for audiobooks. So you can still engage in reading in whatever formats you prefer while still supporting the local bookshop.
And a Libro.fm membership is cheaper than that other one. Just saying. We rarely get to be the one who
I
has
have a
the
question.
cheaper option.
Can you comment on the, or maybe it's in your book, the small bookshop and the bestseller problem? Like, here comes the latest Stephen King, you know? Do I put it in my small store prominently? Because everybody knows that they can get it at a huge discount. Maybe they come in and will pay full price. I don't know. But so what do you do with the hot bestsellers if you're a tiny shop?
Yeah, well, I'll give a brief response, and I'll let Hannah respond to that because she's in the field doing this. But there's always been a tension between booksellers as tastemakers and booksellers as sellers. And there have been many people who railed against popularity, the Book of the Month Club, best-selling lists, etc., and lots of bookstores that situated themselves as literary shops. So even Three Lives is a little different now, and they have plenty of bestsellers. But when I was going there in the early 2000s, they wouldn't have James Patterson's books, and they weren't scoffing at it. It was just like they had limited space. They figured if people wanted it, they could get it elsewhere. But they also thought that that's not what their customers wanted. So they had it. It's changed a little bit since then, and the romantasy books, I think, have sort of blown the roof off of all sorts of sales models. So it's complicated, and individual booksellers think about this, and it's tough if you have a local shop. It's one thing that you can buy it online, but it's another thing if you know Target is also selling the same book at 50% off. It can be a hard sell.
I think there's a couple different things I'll try to get to quickly. I think one, it also depends on what bookselling ecosystem you live in. My bookstore is in Washington, D.C. We are super blessed with a lot of bookstores right inside of Washington, D.C. and right outside of Washington, D.C. I refer people to other bookstores all the time because my shop has a specific focus. We focus on diverse books. That doesn't mean we won't have a Stephen King, but it probably means I made space for one of those instead of a stack of those. Whereas P&P, being a huge physical space, in addition to being a general bookstore, is going to have a stack. So I'm going to refer someone to there, or Solid State, or Lost City, or one of my neighborhood bookshops. If you're the only one within a certain amount of driving distance, you might take that equation differently. The other thing is that if you take pre-orders for books for customers, that is a huge reason to have that best-selling thing, because your customer might want to support you over the Target, but they're not confident you'll have it. And so it just kind of decides how much effort and service you want to put into it. But I think the math for me is, what am I giving physical space to, and how many of selling that book that the average customer on the street is going to walk in and say, do you have XYZ bestseller, is going to allow me to obscure a debut author of color from a small indie press, right? So I do that math all the time. But it is a real question. I think it depends on the balance of where your store is.
So you had talked about how how Ben Franklin was worried about the libraries opening, and how that was going to, disturb book selling. In your historical look at bookstores, how much or what interesting intertwining or back and forth did you see between also the history of libraries and the history of bookstores?
Yeah, so Ben Franklin is famous for starting one of the largest private libraries, and most of the libraries in colonial times were subscription based. So he was this very well educated, curious guy, and basically he and his buddies started this library. And that was not terribly uncommon among the wealthy and elite. And throughout even the 19th century, we get public libraries mostly after the Civil War in terms of taxpayer-funded community libraries. But they tended to be small, didn't necessarily have every book. And so it's very common for bookstores to also have lending libraries for a small fee. And in fact, Walden Books started having libraries, some of the other big chains, Marshall Fields, which I have a whole chapter about in the great heyday of department store book sections, had within their bookstores circulating libraries where you could check out books for a few cents a day. So they were very much intertwined, and they became slightly divorced from one another later through the 20th century. And I think what we're seeing now in the 21st century is that librarians and booksellers, who often find themselves pilloried, are joining forces to not just defend against book banning and promote reading and literacy, but often pooling resources to have events. So if you have a small shop, you can't necessarily host an author that's going to draw 100 people to the crowd. And the libraries are not interested in making money. That's not their purpose. So there's a lot of
The team up is pretty epic at this point.
synergies that you see happening now more than ever in the history of book selling.
So we have about 2 minutes. Any last questions for our speakers? Where?
Thanks for the talk. I'm curious about the way that you're talking about being a reflection of the neighborhood. So I'm thinking about politics and prose. Clearly, the sauce there is that it's a Washington-based thing, and I'm wondering about the places like the big bookstore in Portland. Is that Rose's?
Powell's.
Powell's. Yeah. I mean, what's the secret sauce there? Is it?
Powell's actually started in Chicago.
They still have a warehouse there.
Yeah. So that's part of its appeal, and this is, I think, similar to the Strand, and I have a chapter on that. You know, part of it is the scale and it's become such a brand and a name and a destination that people from Sweden go to New York, they go to the Strand. It's in their guidebook of, go to the Statue of Liberty, go to Ground Zero, go to the Strand. It's a mecca. And some of that is its size, and you can spend hours in there, in this maze of books. And Portland has a similar, brand recognition, which I think is amazing if tourists want to come and go to a bookstore. At the same time, I think it's also important to remember that loyalty is nothing like Powell's bookstore in terms of its scope, in terms of its name recognition. And so I will have colleagues who sometimes, because they want to support indie bookstores, will buy books from Powell's, which I think is great, certainly compared to other
Options.
entities online. But I'm also like, go wherever you're from, go check out. There's probably some small local shop near you, and you can save on shipping and all the rest and check it out. So they're great, but they're also kind of outliers in many ways. Yeah, and the follow-up was just mentioning this sociological term called third spaces, which many people have written about, that are declining in our age when fewer people go to religious worship services, fewer people participate in community softball leagues, and we all lead more insular lives. So how do you kind of engage with the public? And that can just mean sitting at a coffee shop and sort of rubbing shoulders with people and having chit chat, but also places like bookstores that can provide these hubs, these spaces to be surrounded by other people and ideas and spend time out of your house in a way that's productive.
I think the last thing is that while you're all in the tent or are interested in this book, why you wrote the book is when people come to me and they say, oh, we want to be part of the loyalty community, I think of myself as part of the Petworth community. So being part of the loyalty community was a phrase that started happening to us a few years ago. And I went, oh, right, you want to be near people who value the stuff you value, and you see this space as a place to do that. And I think that is what we sometimes are missing when we talk about third place, a place you may not have to spend money or a place that you can go between work and home. You also are looking increasingly for a safe space that has the stuff you value. It's why people go to bookstores after national tragedies, to just be around safe people. So thank you for creating some of that space in the tent today, and thank you to Evan for this book.